Containers are a great tool, but putting your C# application into a container might be intimidating. Setting up a Dockerfile can be complicated, but now with the .NET command line, you can create a Docker container without a Dockerfile. I'll show you how in this 10-minute training video. Now, for most of my training, I work to give you an in-depth perspective on technology, including best practices and implementation details. However, sometimes you just need to get the quick introduction to the topic. That's why I created this 10-minute training series. And for this, we're going to start with an application we built recently, which is our background demo. It's a web API, minimal API setup that just has one endpoint and it's messages. Let's just run it real quick so you can see it, not in a container. We're not doing container yet. We go to messages, try it out, execute, and you can see that it's been executing for about 8 seconds. And if I execute again, there we can see additional executions. So that's the setup. That's the application we're going to start with. Now, I do want to show you that Docker is installed, and I have Docker Desktop. I have no images, and I have no containers. So just, we'll see some images pop up, and we'll create a container for our application. But for now, there's nothing installed. All right, so that's our application. That's what's set up. Now let's come over to the command line, and this is in our project directory. So in the same directory as our CS proj, which is right here, we have this. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to say .NET publish. Now, it's already kind of filling out all the stuff I need, but I want to show what to do. So I'm on Windows. So because I'm on Windows, I want to publish to a Linux container, not a Windows container. The Windows containers are just there as a kind of a bridge to allow you to get things into containers, but really you want to use a Linux container whenever possible. So the Windows containers are basically for containerizing .NET framework applications. So, okay, I want to say --OS is Linux, and then I want --arc for architecture. I want to say x64, and I'm going to say -p : publish profile equals default container. Okay, that's what's telling this system that when you publish, you want to publish to the default container setup. All right, and I do want to say -c release, meaning publish in release mode, because when you're publishing, you probably want the release bit, which is the smaller version of your application. It doesn't have all the debugging things in it. So that's the command to publish our container. There is no Dockerfile in here. Notice on the right-hand side here, you don't see anything special about my API. It's just a normal API. We're going to publish it to a Linux container, a 64-bit Linux container, and we're going to use a default container profile, and we're going to publish it in release mode. So that's going to figure out how to do that, and it's going to publish our application. And once it's done, and notice we're building on top of the Microsoft.com.net ASP.NET 8 version of the container for a base image. So once it's done, we will have an image in our Docker desktop. And there we go. We have our background demo. Notice it's 221 megabytes. You might say, Tim, that's a huge container. Don't worry, we'll shrink it down a little bit later. But for now, that's just the basic container with everything you need, the entire runtime for running our application, which means we can say run here. This is a kind of a shortcut. Notice, again, no containers yet, but we hit run, and it says optional settings. Yes, we want optional settings. We want to change the port to either a port we want to assign or 0 for a randomly generated port number. So that will map the whatever randomly generated port you want to port 8080. Okay, so now it's going to start our application. Notice it mapped 32768 to port 8080. I'm going to open this up, and when I do, I see page can be found. Notice the URL is just the root. But if I do /messages, then there's my data. So now because the way the container set up, I believe it's UTC time that we're getting here, not a local time for my time zone. But if I hit refresh here, Notice it goes a lot further because that background job is running. So we've got our background jobs running in this container. Now, why don't we have Swagger? Well, because we published in release mode. So release mode doesn't get Swagger. We've turned that, that's part of the normal settings. So we could change that, but for now, we're going to leave it alone. Now let's delete this container. Okay, we still have the image back over here, and we'll refresh that and notice 221.21 megabytes. Now, right now, we're using the default for our container. But what we can do is come in here into the program.cs file. We can add the container family, and we can say jammy chiseled. And this is a different type of base container. It's much smaller, which means much smaller images. Then you come back over here to the command line, and we just hit that same command again. We let it run. It will build off of our different base image. Notice the -jammy chiseled, which is a smaller base image. Now I come over here to our Docker, and we look at the background demo, and it's 113.22 megabytes. It's about 100 megabytes smaller, but yeah, it's the same thing. So if we were to launch this and come down here and say 0 and run and launch this web app, and let's bring it over here and say /messages, we get the messages, and if we refresh it, it keeps updating a list. So it still works, and yet we've saved 100 megabytes because we changed the base image, and we did that, let's delete this, we did that by changing our container family to this jammy chiseled. So that's a really quick way to create containers. You can run them locally, or you can even then take those containers and publish them up to the Azure Container Registry, or to the Docker Container Registry, or to another container registry somewhere else, and use them as the basis for a web app or something else. There's a lot more configuration you could do. One of the things you may see that, yes, would make this smaller is if you publish trimmed. Publish trimmed will cut out another 60 megabytes. The problem is, for my particular application, because the fact that we are doing some, this is JSON serialization, even though it's implicit, we're doing JSON serialization, and you've got to set some things up with JSON serialization in order for the trimmed to work properly. And I don't want to go into that in this demo, so we're not going to do trimmed. But just note that if you set your app up properly for working well with trimmed, then it will cut down on the amount of the runtime you have to publish with your application. And so you'll have a much smaller, potentially much smaller image if that's really a concern for you, okay? But when it comes to publishing your image, even if your image is larger, so our image right now is 113 megabytes, but the actual image that is our part of the application is much smaller than that, which means that when we make changes to it, it's just pushing that little change, not the entire image again. And so it really isn't nearly as bad as it might sound if you have 10 versions of this image. So just note that there are a lot of benefits with Docker when it comes to image size. So with that, that's how to use Docker containers and containerize your .NET application, especially a web application, without having a Dockerfile. You can have a Dockerfile if you want, but this command line allows you to do that without having, let me clear the screen here and show it again. This command line allows you to publish to a container very easily without a Dockerfile. And you can continue to tweak it and make it work for you, but this is a whole lot easier than writing out a whole Dockerfile for situations where you don't need it. Okay, that's it. Thanks for watching. And as always, I am Tim Corey.